Hey, my name is Allison. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a community and justice studies major studying Quaker studies as my minor. Happy to be here.
Clara, do you want to go next? Clara, can you hear us?
Oh, hi. Sorry. Yes, my family just walked in and it was really loud and crazy. But I'm Clara. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I don't really have a major department or anything. I'm actually at the early college. So
John, you want to go next?
Hey, my name is Zhihong Chen. Initially from China. Now I'm in the history department at Guilford College. I'm. Did I say my pronouns already? She, her, hers. Yeah, that's it.
Thanks, John. And then Maria.
Hi, I'm Maria, and my pronouns is she, her. And I'm in sociology major in International Christian University in Japan, and now I'm studying at Guilford College as a next gen student. Yes, thank
So
you.
just also, first of all, very nice to meet everyone. My question, I guess, Sonalini, is that like, so this is at Guilford, but this is also UNCG?
It is a co-taught class
Okay.
partnership between Thea, who's now at UNCG, and Guilford. And so the class is being kind of run out of Guilford, but in partnership with the credit for the class is run out of Guilford. But it's being co-taught with UNCG.
Oh, cool. Asma's here. Sweet. Okay.
Do you want to do an introduction for Asma as well?
I don't know. Asma, do you want to introduce yourself? That would be a no.
Hey, sorry, I just got on and I wasn't even really on when you asked that question. Hi, I'm Shyam's friend and interested in this topic and would love to hear him speak about it. So thank you for letting me join.
Why don't you say where you live, Asma?
I live in Kansas City, Missouri.
There you go. See, I'm just, because you were like, hi, I'm Shyam's friend and I'm here to learn. And I just wanted to give a little bit more detail, that's all.
Okay, well, yeah, I'm here in Kansas City. I'm from the Midwest. So.
All right, yes. And Asma is being modest. She works on civil rights work with the Muslim community at the national stage. And she's a very important person. So, but anyway, okay, so let me just talk a little bit about why I got interested in refugees and, you know, why, and this particular topic, why it resonates with me. And, you know, like, I believe that the best work, right, that you can do comes from a very personal place. Like, if you love something and you believe that you are personally connected to it, then the research doesn't feel like research. It feels like it's just an extension of who you are. Now, there's an irony in that because I think Guilford, from what my experience, and Sonali and I did something last semester where we brought our classes together after the election to kind of talk about things. I think Guilford is very much focused on like experiential learning and active learning and that advocacy and passion. And I went to a very kind of traditional graduate department where I was explicitly told by people on my committee that I should not be an advocate for the people that I'm doing research on. That advocacy is bad, that it has to be quantitative, it has to be numerical. And I kind of pushed away with that. And even my topic of refugee resettlement, there was no one in political science at UC Santa Barbara that does refugee resettlement, but each person on my committee served like a different purpose. Like, I had one person on the committee who was a public opinion person. I had one person who was a political socialization person. One person was public policy, and one person was Asian American politics. Okay, so everyone did different things, but definitely I would say, and you know, for those of you who are in graduate school or wanting to go to graduate school or whatever, that a big thing that people don't talk about is that fit of what is a good graduate program. You have to find a program where the faculty there see your vision. I think oftentimes there's a tendency when you go to graduate school of how you will fit into the research agenda of a professor, but very little about what about if your research agenda is different from that of a professor? Will the professor be open to seeing you reach your goals and not always helping them with their projects? And I think sometimes there's that disconnect in graduate school. So how did I get involved in refugee stuff? Because when I first did my first master's degree, which is when I met Sonalini in like the early 2000s, when I was at Georgia State and she, I believe, was at the University of Kentucky. No,
Vanderbilt.
Vanderbilt. But then, yeah, no, not Kentucky. Neil Tate was at Kentucky.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so at Vanderbilt, I was close. Kentucky, Tennessee, it's not too bad, right? But the thing is that one of my first amazing opportunities when I was a grad student was I was an AmeriCorps volunteer. And for 1 year, I did after school tutoring for refugee youth in Stone Mountain, Georgia, which is just east of Atlanta. And that really opened up the opportunity to like work with children from Vietnam, from the former Yugoslavia, from Somalia, from the Gambia. And it was a very powerful experience. Then fast forward to like 2008, I started teaching at this community college east of Atlanta in Clarkston. And Clarkston is where all refugees are resettled when they first come to the state. So you can imagine how diverse that college town was. So many different, I mean, most people say that Clarkston is the most diverse town in America by virtue of its size and the number of people represented there. So I became deeply passionate about the refugee experience and seeing refugees and former refugees, not by the label, but by as people. So when I got to graduate school, I knew I wanted to do something about refugees, but I wasn't sure. And I don't know if I should thank him, but President Trump's xenophobia drove me to deciding to choose this topic and wanting to really understand refugee resettlement. Well, what makes refugee resettlement so fascinating in the US is that historically it's been kind of under the radar, right? Like most people in the US till maybe 4 years ago could care less about refugee resettlement. And that's kind of the danger that President Trump did is he politicized it. Suddenly he made it political and everyone started to focus on it. But by all accounts, it really was under the undersurface. Like if you yourself were a refugee, then you knew about how it worked, how refugee resettlement organizations work with the national government, and they work with states. And most people didn't know how that process worked. But then what happened was Trump said, no, we don't want to accept Syrian refugees. And he politicized it as if Syrian refugees were going to be resettled and they were going to cause all sorts of terrorism. And then I realized that in political science, and political science, let's be honest, is years behind sociology, anthropology, ethnic studies. It's often the discipline that is the slowest to catch up with the rest of the world, sadly. And I think Sonali and I can honestly say this, political science is very backwards, very lags other disciplines. So even refugee resettlement traditionally is a topic that you read about in sociology or anthropology, not poli-sci. So what I realized is that there was really no research in American politics about refugee resettlement. And to me, that seemed insane because it is incredibly political and government, right? It involves the local, every level of government is involved, right? Local level, state level, federal level. You have the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is in Health and Human Services, and they write memoranda of agreement with these national organizations like Catholic Charities or International Rescue Committee, and then they decide which states have the most resources to take refugees, the most availability of housing and jobs and other things, and then they work with their local affiliates, and then their local affiliates work with other people, and you have this huge, incredible, like what I would use from an Indian perspective, masala, this incredible combination of people working together. But then what I realized during the dissertation was the reason why refugee resettlement is so critical for us to study is because it is so poorly done in the United States, right? Like even though the US between 1975 and like 2020 has taken in about 3.5 million refugees, okay? The way it is done is a bit of a mess because, you know, anyone who knows anything about American politics knows that the biggest problem in American politics is federalism, right? Each state is basically allowed to pass policies that work for that state, but maybe not in other states. So a good example, and anyone who has been following the news in the last few years, for example, before the 2015 Supreme Court decision, Oberfeld versus Hodges, that created marriage equity, you had a situation in the US where half the states made same-sex marriage legal, and then half the states made it illegal. So a same-sex couple, like two women, for example, get married in Iowa, which legalized same-sex marriage, but if they moved to Georgia, the marriage was invalid. So, and that's why the Supreme Court stepped in. But refugee resettlement is like all over. Every state can kind of create its own policies. So one of the big findings I realized in my dissertation, so I compared to Georgia and California, which are the two states I knew best. And what I really found was refugee success in America. And how do we measure success? Ability to get jobs, ability to stay gainfully employed, finish high school, learn a certain amount of English, not become dependent on the welfare that is provided, right? That varies incredibly based on the state that someone is resettled in. So think about that, right? That means that two refugees, let's say from the same country. So I study refugees from Bhutan, but pick a country, right? Like from the Democratic Republic of Congo, right? Right? They have the same qualifications, the same everything in the country of origin, but their success is not determined necessarily about who works harder. It's about who got resettled in a state that cares about refugees and who got resettled in a state that doesn't care. But that choice is not up to them. So my argument, right, and the reason I'm so grateful that Sonalini asked me to talk about this, is that based on what state they get resettled in is directly responsible for their success, which means the system is so highly unequal, right? It's almost like like if the goal is to help refugees, right, become American or integrate into American society, then there should be a standard way that refugees are treated, but refugees are treated very differently. And different ethnic communities are treated differently when they come to the US. Like there's so much research now that, for example, Ukrainian Jewish refugees that started to get resettled in the 1980s and 90s, fleeing communism, whatever, they were given much better treatment by refugee resettlement organizations than refugees from other countries. So even if and I think I saw in your syllabus that you guys were reading something by Eric Tang. Okay, that book of his, Unsettled, is perhaps the best book ever written about how effing insane the refugee resettlement process in the US, because he followed, I think, Burmese refugees, right?
I think Cambodian.
Cambodian, yeah, like a one woman in particular he followed for a number of years. They were treated so poorly in New York. He even called their experience the hyper ghetto, right, of where they lived. They were given so few opportunities, the worst possible housing, worst possible opportunities. And that whole community, you could argue, was kind of set back because their resettlement was not taken as seriously by the US government. So then why does the US government insist on taking in refugees if they're not being treated well? So this is a trick, and I'll stop after this so we can open it up a little bit, but think about how what I'm saying is it's kind of crazy, right? I want the US to have a robust resettlement program. I even gave a lecture a few days ago where I said the litmus test, right, of how strong a democracy is how strong the resettlement program is. And the fact that under President Trump, we have gradually reduced the number of refugees to the lowest it has ever been, okay, since 1975. And I'll send some articles I've written to Sonalini to share with you. And you can see how even under Republican presidents like Reagan and both the Bush presidents, it was very robust. Under Trump, it has been very low. But the thing is that that's terrible. I want a robust resettlement program, but I want a resettlement program where all refugees are given the opportunity to succeed. So what I'm saying is I want refugees to be resettled, but they have to be resettled with a thought to their success. And I think refugees are the client, right? They're the ones who are supposed to get everything. They're the ones that people care about the least. from what I've seen, like people aren't even thinking what the refugees want. It's kind of like what the states want, what the refugee resettlement organizations want, what the caseworkers want, but what the refugees want is neglected. Does that all make sense? Very impassioned way to start, I guess. And before I continue, first of all, any questions about any of that? So Nalini, do you have any questions?
Allison, look like you might want to unmute.
Yeah, that was really great. One thing that you talked a bit about is like this idea of like success. And I was wondering kind of like what does that look like to you? Like obviously our current system is failing at that. But like given your studies and scholarship, like what I guess constitutes that and like which direction should we be moving in?
Okay, excellent question. I'll give you two answers to that, all right, how I measure success. So the first is there's a concept in political science and public policy about what they call negative and positive feedback. Okay, so positive feedback or positive feedback design is when you create a public policy that empowers a certain group of people, and then they are so empowered that they go on to do something more positive themselves, and then it creates a positive feedback loop. Okay, the best example of a positive feedback loop in US policy is the GI Bill. Okay, and there's a book by Suzanne Mettler called Soldiers to Citizens about how post-World War II, US government comes up with this concept of the GI Bill, which is that veterans can go back to college for free. And that now, like the children of veterans and the spouses of veterans can also go to college. And the belief was you tell people, okay, you're going to serve in the military, but now we're going to help you go to college. And then that generation then became very involved in public service, right? That post-World War II generation, much more likely to go into public service. And the belief was they were getting that positive feedback from the government, and then they paid it forward back into the government, okay? But there are also negative feedback loop. A negative feedback loop is when the group gets services that are very poor quality, and then they in turn do not really give back into the system. And I will sad to say that most social policy in the United States is a negative feedback loop. So for example, welfare, okay? And specifically, let's talk about SNAP, right? Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, right? Previously known as TANF, Temporary Assistance to Needy Families. It's now different things. So there are millions of Americans who are dependent on SNAP, okay? And in fact, the next time you go to the grocery store, you might even see a sticker that says WIC approved. WIC means women, infants, and children, right? So like you have a huge, like every state has SNAP distribution. But the thing is, there's an argument that while these programs are amazing and vital and people, we need them, the people who are on SNAP often never actually escape the poverty associated with SNAP. And then there is less incentive to then quote unquote give back and contribute to society, because there's an argument, and this might blow some of your minds or maybe not if you're a little bit more pessimistic, that there's an argument that the US government, as much as for everyone says welfare is bad, the US government actually prefers that some people are always dependent on welfare, because then they are always dependent on government services. Think about how insane that is, right? Because everyone says welfare is bad, but the same people who say welfare is bad are also wanting people to be dependent on the government. Why do you think that is? Anyone? Not just Allison, but if you go ahead, you can start.
I guess like just part of it is that like these jobs that are created through the government to like quote unquote like help people, and rather than giving people the resources that they need, it's easier for the government to just hire somebody else to like try to do that, and I think like do it less effectively than just giving people the resources that they need themselves.
I agree. I think that's part of the answer. Anyone else want to chime in?
Maybe to keep the status quo, keep the system where some people are just shackled to low-paid jobs all the time, no escape.
Yeah, so there's a really famous American author named Douglas Copeland. He coined the expression Gen X, and he referred to the kind of job you're talking about as a mech job, right? Which is no benefit, like limited benefits, limited pay, limited opportunity, right? No, I'm not taking away. There are people who are managers at McDonald's and they probably are making more money than I am, which is great. But the argument is that it's kind of like that America says we have these jobs, but these are not jobs that really in the long run really offer potential. But they make people feel good temporarily, but perhaps not in the long term. And there's also an argument that, yeah, people do work at McDonald's, millions of people, but that also means that millions of people are contributing to a society where we're eating very poor food. Right? Does that make sense? Like these are not really like in the long run, they do not sustain an economy, right? So you understand the positive, negative feedback. So here's the problem, right? The problem is that refugee resettlement on paper appears positive, right? Which is you're giving people from another country opportunities that other immigrants don't get. So let's talk about that for a second. What are some things that refugees get in the US that immigrants do not? As refugees as a type of immigrant. So refugees get certain things. What are some of those things that they receive that other non-refugees do not get? Let's start with Clara, the silent killer in the corner.
Oh no. Isn't it, don't you get housing for 6 months?
Yeah, it depends on the state, but yeah, let's say 6 months housing. Okay. What else?
It was in your article.
Not just you, anyone else. Yeah.
I mean, isn't there like food stamp benefits for a while?
Yeah, there's food stamp benefits. Yeah, food stamp, housing. What else?
Maybe some assistance to language
Yes,
training.
Absolutely. ESL classes, English as a second language classes. What else?
And a quicker timeline to get a green card. Much
100%.
quicker. Yeah.
Not just green card, you have 5 year to get citizenship, right? I know people that it takes them 30 years to become a US citizen. And the US government now has such an incredible backlog of applicants from India. There are some people who have been told, Sonali, I don't know if you heard the story, there are some H-1B workers who have been told that it might take 20 to 30 years for them to get citizenship or for even their things to be processed. And that's just India. Forget about countries that are enemies of the US. So Iran, North Korea, you bring up a whole, like very limited chance, right? So the argument is that, so housing assistance, they may also get rent assistance, but they definitely get a lot of benefits that other immigrants do not get. So ostensibly, right, someone might say, no, refugee settlement is positive feedback, right? You're bringing up people to the US, you're helping them settle in, you're giving them all of these tools. But I'm arguing that, unfortunately, a lot of experiences that refugees have, yes, there are a lot of refugee success stories, okay? Ilhan Omar, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, it's a Somali refugee success story, of course. There are many examples of Ilhan Omars, but there's millions of people in the US who came as refugees, even 40 years ago from Cambodia or from Laos, the Khmer people, the Hmong people who have never escaped poverty, right? And there's an argument that they were resettled often in states that were not actually open to them being resettled there, right? So we talk about the Hmong people, for example, right? But there are Hmong in Texas that when they got resettled there, and Vietnamese who got resettled there like 1975, 76, there was so much opposition to their resettlement by locals who were like, oh, we just fought them in Vietnam and now they're coming here and we don't want them here and they're taking our jobs. And that creates kind of an intergenerational trauma, right? So this is the second part of your question, Allison, is, about this topic, about like why the success, why the inequality. The reason why I'm passionate about it and why I think refugee resettlement needs to be studied more is that the Bhutanese, the reason I even chose the Bhutanese community is because they had at one point the highest rate of suicide among any immigrant or refugee group in the US, like astronomically high rate. And they've only been resettled in the US since 2008. So they were being resettled, and there's an argument that, there was a lot of disruption. Now, I personally have experienced multiple suicides when I was at Purdue as an undergrad, and that always primed me to be able to talk about suicide with other people. So when I started teaching at Georgia Perimeter College, I had a lot of these Bhutanese refugees as students. And once I got to know the community, I felt very compelled to kind of want to become like an advocate for them or an ally for them. So then once I started to explore, I realized, and this is, I think, one of the big findings of my work, is that I do believe that in its own way, the refugee resettlement process exacerbates sometimes the mental health and trauma of refugees. Okay, and I'm not the only one who does this. Like Melissa Borja, who's a professor at the University of Michigan, she's an expert on refugee resettlement also. She's been looking at a long time about how, here's something that nobody talks about. How come nobody talks about that 95 or 98% of all resettlement organizations in the US are religious based, Christian based, right? So what is the long-term effect of having religious based refugee resettlement with refugees who themselves are not Christian? Most are not Christian. I mean, some are. But what is the long term? And some people argue that this is capitalism. Other people say this is colonialism. Why does the US government sign these huge contracts with religious based organizations to resettle refugees? Is it Orientalism? Like, what drives it? Because, for example, if you look at Australia, most of their resettlement organizations are secular. Very few are religious, but in the US, it's the opposite. So one of the big findings from my work so far is that because refugees are not taken, that their voices are minimized in the resettlement process, their needs are minimized. People don't like, it's sad. People say they want to work with refugees, but I think most people are so stuck in the policy or in the process, they lose sight of the client. And I think that if you lose sight of the client, especially a group of people who are new to the United States, who don't have a lot of local kinship opportunities, you are setting them up to fail mentally. And I think that is unconscionable, that you would bring a group of people to America to escape violence, and then you would subject them to racism and discrimination and just like a very callous attitude here, and not give them the tools of success. I mean, and I wish people, I mean, look, my goal is I want to be one of those people, and I'm hoping now with the Biden-Harris transition, like we do know that like the 1979 Refugee Act, which was sponsored initially by Senator Ted Kennedy, but one of the 14 co-sponsors was Senator Biden. And there's a general feeling that he is going to kickstart the refugee resettlement program again. But I'm just here to tell you, it's not enough. They need a program that resettles people, but takes care of people, their mental health needs. Like, that's the thing. How do you measure refugee success? Let's ask that question. I'll ask each of you, including, I think, is it Marissa? Maria, you can start since you haven't spoken yet. What qualifies as refugee success?
I think it's like having stable job or like financial status, I think.
Okay, stable job, stable finances, definitely. Okay, what else? How else would we measure what we would call integration of refugees?
I think there needs to be a sense of wholeness. That is, you feel a sense of fulfillment.
Okay.
And including feel comfortable in your cultural or religious background. Wherever you settle, you feel comfortable with it. You feel whole as a person.
Excellent. Thank you. Allison and Clara.
I think like part of that is like long-term support services, including but like not limited to like healthcare.
Absolutely. And Clara, what do you think?
I'm sorry, my dog is barking, but I guess all like protection by the U.S. government and then like rights being acknowledged and embraced by the surrounding community.
Absolutely, right? So these are all, I think, very good markers of success. I would also add that one thing that nobody mentioned, which I think is probably the primary marker for the US government, is naturalization, right? Nobody talks about it. Nobody talks about it, but 100%. Why would the US government, like, how many of you are familiar with the term like neoliberal, right? Refugee resettlement is inherently a neoliberal enterprise. It is about markets and strength and even US immigration policy, right? People talk about it like it's some sort of altruistic endeavor. It's about getting a certain type of immigrant to fulfill a certain type of job. Okay. For example, right? My parents are both doctors. They both emigrated. My dad came in 74. My mom came in 76. Okay. I'm the first person in my family born in America. Okay. Why did my dad come to the US in 1974? I could ask him and he could say, oh, there was, opportunities in the US and he wanted to do an ophthalmology residency, whatever, whatever. But the reality is because America needed doctors. Why did America need doctors? Because their doctors were going to Vietnam, right? And doctors from India speak English because it's a British colony, right? So, I mean, I look, my dad ended up in the US and he got here, and I'm here because he came here. But I am here because the US needed English speaking doctors. So then there was a priority then about getting doctors from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Kenya, Nigeria. What are this commonality? British colonies, right? Like it's not a surprise, right? Like I'm here as a result of like these neoliberal policies. So I would argue that refugee resettlement is also a neoliberal policy, but the goal, see people say, oh, we accept refugees because, Emma Lazarus, give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses. The US accepts refugees because they're hoping that those refugees will become US citizens. 100%. That's why the markers are, how do they measure success? Job creation, language acquisition, right? Now, is it Jiong? Jiong mentioned wholeness, right? That's what I want too. I want wholeness. I want mental health. I want refugees to feel like they belong. They don't face discrimination, that they're not being treated as second-class citizens or what Claire Kim calls perpetually foreign, which I'm sure Jihong, myself, Marie, I'm sure anyone here who has ever lived overseas has probably and come to the US has received this, which is, where are you from? How come you don't have an accent? How long have you lived here, right? But of course, I want people in the long run to not have to deal with that stuff, right? To be accepted. But I think that even there's an argument that even under the Biden team that may not happen, that they're still going to focus on resurrecting the refugee program with the idea of bringing people to America to save them. But are they saving their minds? I don't think that happens enough. That's the problem. Okay. So any questions about any of that stuff before I share a few of the things from my dissertation, from my research?
Shyam, would you mind if I jumped in with just a
Of
couple?
course, it's your class.
This has been great. No, thank you. But I wanted to ask about something that you said about local kinship networks, and I don't know if I read this. So I did read part of your dissertation.
Oh no.
No, no, it was really.
That's like reading all Harry Potter, right? Like it's yeah.
It's it's expensive, no, for sure. But it was so I'm not sure if it was in your dissertation or this article, but so you mentioned that earlier the U.S. government was dinged for like settling Cubans in Miami, in Florida, for instance, and like settling Vietnamese people. I've forgotten which state, but and so now the refugee resettlement program tends to be more dispersed. To like they'll drop people anywhere. It sounds like from some of your research that you're suggesting that that's probably not a good idea. Is that so? That's one question. Is that why was it so criticized? Putting groups like enclaves of people together. Why was that such a critical a policy that was criticized? And then I guess my second question was around, uh, you mentioned that, you know, in your mind, are there states that do refugee resettlement in the U.S. well, and even in a more transnational perspective, like are there? I know there are only a handful of countries that do kind of third-party refugee resettlement. So are there countries internationally that you think do a pretty good job of refugee resettlement? You mentioned Australia, for instance. Yeah, and I wondered if there were other countries maybe in Europe that you think do a
Sure.
better job than us.
Great question, Sonalini, and I appreciate them. And I think you and I are on the same page on a lot of these things and these topics. Okay, so let me just I'll work backwards. I believe, and again, there are very few countries that actually have like a very robust refugee program. So can someone raise their hand and tell me which country took in the most Syrian refugees? Maria?
Jordan?
No, but
No.
Jordan took in a lot. You're right.
So I know that a lot of them pass through Turkey. I don't know whether Turkey does any resettlement.
So Turkey took in 3.5 million Syrian refugees. But that's a good point about resettlement because people, for example, the largest refugee camp in the world outside of, well, some people say Gaza is the largest refugee camp in the world, but outside of Gaza, the largest one was on the island of Lesbos in Greece. It actually burned down last year. Some people said it's the worst place on earth, like hell. The thing is, a lot of those folks, right, like they would live in the refugee camp in Greece, but they never got Greek citizenship, right? So it just became a place for them to transition through. That's actually a really good point that you bring up, which is a country can hold refugees but not resettle them. Okay. For example, Bosnia, I got a chance to visit Bosnia and Herzegovina 2 years ago. It was an incredible experience. Bosnia has refugee camps, but I don't think there's any process for those refugees to become Bosnian citizens, right? That's a big part of this that nobody wants to talk about. So Turkey did take in a lot of Syrian refugees. I don't know, I have to look up the numbers as to how many of them ultimately have stayed in Turkey and how many left and went somewhere else, but they took in quite a few. Now, Germany also took in a lot, and Germany got a lot of flack for it, but the ones that did stay, I believe that many of them have become successful, have become German citizens. But I will say that I think the best program in the world is Canada, right? As usual, right? But Canada, I'll tell you why Canada's is so good. Because what Canada does that I think the US did briefly after Vietnam is that what Canada does is they encourage local people, just ordinary Canadians, to host refugees. Right now, there was some of this in the US, especially after Vietnam, where Americans were given the chance to host families. There was actually like a Disney movie in the 80s, I think, called The Girl Who Spelled Freedom. I remember watching it about like a girl who was displaced with her family. I think it was from Cambodia, but it might have been Laos. And she comes and lives in Texas and she goes to school and then she becomes like a spelling bee champion and true story, right? But I think there was a few experiences like that. But even those families were often picked by a church, like Lutheran services would get a contract to resettle 10,000 refugees from, I don't know, Bosnia, right? And then what they would do is they would ask local families who belong to that church, will you take in a Bosnian or a Bosniak, which is a Bosnian Muslim family? And that happened. But that's not a big thing in the US anymore, right? Canada still does it, right? Canada still, when people can take in refugees. And I think that is such a beautiful and powerful thing of bringing someone into your home and giving them, like we do, you've heard of people hosting foreign students, right? You've heard of, and there's very common now to adopt children from overseas. But I don't know why we don't have the system of adopting families and helping a family succeed. I think that would, I mean, I hate to use this expression and maybe it will die after tomorrow, but I think we need to make refugee hosting great again, okay? Like I'm just saying, it's like, I think if we took refugees into our homes and gave them that kind of one-on-one affection, then I think that would really ameliorate their long-term success in the country. Like they would feel like they really belong. I don't think that's happening right now. Okay, so Canada has the best program. So Sonalini, you mentioned Cuba. So Cuba is fascinating because a large number of Cuban refugees obviously came to Florida because Florida is very near Cuba, right? So they got to Florida, and then they used to have this long policy program called wet foot, dry foot, that if you landed in Cuba, then you automatically were granted asylum, and then people stayed there. Now, I will say that Florida still has the largest Cuban American population in the US, and that's not going to change. But what is fascinating, though, is that there was a lot of pushback to Cuban refugees because there was a belief that a lot of them were bringing crime. Okay, that is the basis for the movie Scarface, right? Like Cubans were bringing drugs and crime allegedly. And it also was racism because for a while in the early 80s, people blamed AIDS on Cuban, Haitian, Dominican immigrants and refugees. And that actually resulted in a drop in public support for refugees because people believed that these groups were bringing AIDS, which we know is not true. But there was a lot of that xenophobia mixed with other things going on at that time. Now, I will say this is that I think, and again, this is the important part, is I think what happens is that there are communities that get resettled in the US that they don't have any linguistic ties with any other groups. For example, Africa or even like just Somalia or Somaliland, that area, we're talking about lots of different languages. So one group of people that is common, not just in Somalia, but Somalia, Kenya, Rwanda, etc., are the Bantu people. They don't speak Somali, right? Which is actually more closely in line with Arabic. So the thing is, if you resettle Somali Bantu people in places where there are large Somalis, there's no guarantee that they're actually going to get together. In fact, what we saw in Georgia was a lot of inter-kinship violence and discrimination between Somali speakers and Bantu speakers. But see, this shows you how poor the American, not just resettlement is, but just thinking how languages work. The presumption that people from the same part of the world will speak the same language, and refugee resettlement organizations, caseworkers not understanding that difference. So then you have a Bantu family and you give them a Somali caseworker. That would be like giving a Bosnian family a Serbian caseworker, right? And I love Dia shaking her head like, no, right.
I'm just horrified. That's
But
horrifying.
it's nice to finally meet you.
Same.
Same.
Thank you.
So yeah, and I think that lack of cultural sensitivity is a big problem in the refugee resettlement world, right? And refugee resettlement organizations are often dependent on these volunteers to help with language translation. But this goes back to the point I made about this whole Christian bias in America. I know firsthand that a lot of these translators sometimes are asked to sign a statement that they are doing the work to serve Jesus, right? I've heard of those stories from Georgia, like, and this will be like a hijabi, right? A muhajjaba, like a woman wearing a headscarf who is Muslim, who is there to translate in Arabic or Farsi or Somali, being told you have to sign this statement saying you work for World Relief or Baptist Services or whatever, and that you are doing this to fulfill God's mission on earth through Jesus Christ. And like, are we resettling people or are we trying to convert them to Christianity? Right? And yes, Dr. Abdo.
Oh, no, I'm just wondering how much that has to do with the fact that the initial model for refugee resettlement and co-sponsorship happened through a lot of churches and faith communities.
Absolutely.
Is that a holdover from that?
It is. And we were talking about that before. And in fact, actually, if you look even further, a lot of the resettlement, or for example, okay, Vietnam, right? So typical US foreign policy, we go into another country and we precipitate a refugee crisis by our involvement there. The reason why America takes in so many people from Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, etc., is because the US was there for over 10 years, destabilized the whole region. The reason we have so many Iraqis in the US now is because the US destabilized Iraq. It's not a coincidence. We do this over and over again. But what happened was a lot of those initial refugee resettlement organizations, as Dr. Abdo said, are Christian based, right? And by the way, I keep saying doctor only because I'm so upset with this whole Jill Biden nonsense that she's not a real doctor. I'm just going to call Sonali Dr. Sapra. But I just remember that when we did the last thing that Guilford prefers first names. So yeah. Yeah. Dr. Jill Biden. Okay. Doctor. Right. My mom was a doctor. And even to this day, when they send invites to my house for something, they say Dr. and Mrs. Right? My mom has been a doctor since 1976, and she still gets Dr. and Mrs. Sexism much? Right. Anyway, I digress. So what happened was when they were initially figuring out who should be accepted into the US as refugee, a lot of refugees were first resettled in the Philippines, right? And in those organizations, the Philippines were all Christian based. And in fact, I've talked to refugees from Bhutan, from Myanmar, from Laos, from Somalia, from Nigeria, from the DRC, from other places. And almost all of them have had some experience of some kind of like latent or light kind of Christian instruction, right? It's not like in their face, like you must go to Sunday school, right? But it's like, and I've also heard other stories too, where like, for example, a local church will send a van to an area, a neighborhood that has a lot of refugees to see if anybody wants to go to church on Sunday, knowing full well that the people there may be Taoist or Muslim or any other religion. So it just makes me think like, is it really support to make people feel comfortable, or is it support to convert people to Christianity? I think that's really scary. The other thing, to answer, Sonalini, some of your questions, is that one of the reasons why, okay, so I mentioned, right, it's very difficult sometimes placing refugees in communities where other people speak the same language because there's so much diversity. I will say that often I think the plan is to resettle people where there are jobs. Okay, so for example, there is a very large Bhutanese refugee community in South Dakota. Why? Because there's jobs in South Dakota, in Rapid City and other places. And oftentimes states will take in refugees if they feel like they can offer them the jobs, that there's low cost housing, etc. So there is that belief sometimes of breaking up ethnic enclaves and spreading people out that way. But I would agree with you, Sonali, that the downside is that since nobody's actually asking the refugees themselves what they want, they end up getting placed in places where they really have to discover their own community. I see the thing that I wish we did in the US more, and maybe Dia's work in North Carolina more locally is doing that, but it's not being done nationally, is refugees kind of looking out for each other, right? Like, for example, Robin, who is my interpreter for the Nepali interpreter in Oakland, he has now moved to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and they've started a group called Asian Refugees United, which brings together refugees from Bhutan, Burma, etc., to all work together on common issues. And I wish that happened more. Because I think what happens is that each refugee group that comes to America sadly falls into that pattern of you are the new group now, so we are going to have animosity towards you because you're coming here to take our jobs. Like, I wish refugees were actually helping each other more establish themselves, especially when it comes to things like mental health, but I just don't see that enough nationally. Maybe it happens locally. Let me mention one more thing too. So remember I asked earlier about how we measure, like we were talking about refugee integration, like how you measure that. I think the best system that has been developed to measure it is a survey that was administered in Colorado a few years ago called RISE, like Refugee Integration Survey. And it asks like 40 or 50 questions across like 10 different domains, how you measure integration. And I think what they've done is really awesome because, for example, something that most people don't think about that I think is a great marker of refugee integration is, have you attended a PTA meeting at your child's school, right? Have you ever called 911, right? And let's talk about that for a second. People take 911 for granted. But some of the refugees I interviewed, the older ones from Bhutan, they said it is illegal in Bhutan to look a policeman in the eye. If it's illegal to look a policeman in the eye, who is going to feel comfortable calling the police or the fire department to your house for an emergency? So building, and of course we have all the stuff that happened last year, or just institutional violence towards refugees and minorities and people of color and their bodies. So how do you encourage people to feel dependent on public safety and law enforcement when they don't believe that public safety and law enforcement is really looking out for them? It's a big problem, right? Like across the US in more impoverished communities. Like someone starts a house fire, ostensibly you should call 911, but what if you believe in calling 911, they feel that their kids are going to be taken away from them, or they feel that they're going to lose their citizenship, which is unlikely to happen because they're refugees, they're not going to lose it, but they don't know enough about the political realities of the system. But they do know all the horror stories they hear about of police being called for a wellness check and then someone is dead. That has happened several times in the US. It just happened recently in, I think, Minneapolis also. The police were called for a wellness check and someone ended up dead. So I think that's an important piece.
Maybe, Shyam, you can talk about the public charge and the way that that has also, under Trump, made people really fearful of reaching out and seeking public service. Yeah.
Absolutely, and we already spoke about that a little.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I presented a meeting.
It's all good. Don't worry.
Yeah.
I know you just came in, but like, I think the most challenging legacy, and I'm using this word in a specific way, is even though President Trump is only in office for like one day today, right? I mean, I want to be more optimistic, but I think that he has so fundamentally altered how Americans look at refugees that I think it's going to take like 10 or 20 years to fix. It's very hard for me to say that because I want, more, I want them to raise the refugee ceiling. I want to see lots of refugees come to the US, but he has got two things have happened, right? One is he has convinced so many Americans that refugees are bad, not just as a source of terrorism, right? There's Islamophobia at work, there's all that stuff. But just like, America, which has such a rich refugee experience, has really turned on refugees. Refugees has become, like Junaid Rana, who's an amazing professor at the University of Illinois. He did this book called Terrifying Muslims about the biggest consequence of 9/11 is not only the racialization of Muslims to look a certain way, but that a racialization that is accompanied by criminality. So it's not just that you look Muslim, but you must be guilty because you are Muslim. Trump has done that with refugees. And let's take it a step further, okay? According to the 1951 United Nations Convention on Refugees, and I think the 1967 protocol, right? It is an international right to seek asylum. But last year, Trump, by executive order, made it illegal to seek asylum at the southern border. How is that possible? It is illegal to seek asylum, but it is now currently illegal. So if you approach the southern border seeking asylum, they won't take you in because he has passed an executive order. So he's fundamentally changed how America thinks about refugees. And even if on day one, tomorrow, I guess, or the day after tomorrow, President Biden changes everything, it's going to take a long time to fix. But the other problem, going to Dia's point, is that, I mean, think about the situation refugees are in, like, or people from certain countries, specifically from Syria or Somalia, Sudan, etc., right? That you are essentially being told nobody wants you, but maybe the US wants you, but now the US doesn't want you, so go back to your camp, or in Yemen, which has probably the worst humanitarian crisis in the world right now is happening in Yemen. And now people are being told, no, now we want you to come back into the US. And I just feel so bad that refugees are in the terrible position of having to figure out which country is going to treat me fairly, right? And that it's just, we have done so much damage, the United States administration in the last 5 years alone. Like, and I mentioned this Dia earlier, that by the comparison, Ronald Reagan is like Mahatma Gandhi, probably not the best example, but Ronald Reagan is like a saint to refugee policy. George Herbert Walker Bush is like a saint in terms of the number of people who were resettled in the US in the 4 years he was president. It was like 500,000 people, refugees accepted. And then by that standard, Donald Trump, it's a terrible situation. I just think that I really don't know how they're going to fix this, because you've convinced a portion of American population that refugees are bad, and then you've also made refugees feel so unwelcome. And you've also made refugees almost being turned on by other minorities. So, Dia, what do you think about this? Like, how do you think, you have a more optimistic view than I do?
I don't know. I agree with you that the Trump administration has done a lot of damage, not just to, I mean, if we're thinking about this holistically, not just to the resettlement program, but to folks who are doing that work here. I mean, I'm sure you've mentioned it, but the layoffs that happened to refugee resettlement agencies, the decimation to the infrastructure, right? I mean, Greensboro itself is a refugee resettlement hub. Just the number of places that, I just had to lay people off because there aren't the numbers of refugees coming in to do that work. So he's also decimated the economic infrastructure of refugee resettlement support.
Right. I mean, yeah. So like 2 examples of that I think people don't take into account, right? So for example, Republicans love to talk about like small businesses and entrepreneurship. Refugees are the most likely immigrant group to start small businesses, right? Most likely to take out loans and pay them back, most likely to finish high school often and not engage in truancy. And there's all these stats, right? But I agree with Dia, like there's so many of these small towns, Clarkston, Georgia, Rochester, Minnesota, Utica, New York, Greensboro, North Carolina, Utah. Utah actually, surprisingly, even though it's a quote unquote a conservative state, they really love refugees, actually.
There's one there's one, oh my God, Fort Wayne? Fort Wayne.
Well,
Indiana.
It used to. But again, as you said, because of everything.
Yeah.
But these cities, right, like they welcomed refugees because refugees revitalized, like these are cities that were dying. They were affected, Rust Belt cities often were affected by layoffs. And then you have Utica, New York, the whole town was basically saved by refugees who came in, who bought up local businesses, turned house of worship, schools, stores, etc. And they saved the town. Nobody wants to talk about that. And then Dia's point is so valid. For example, I teach in Indianapolis, and Butler does a lot of civic engagement. And when I told people I wanted my students to get some experience working with refugees, they were like, oh, there's this Exodus Immigration Refugee Services, and there's some other group. I reach out to them, they're like, we're not taking any more volunteers because we don't have enough refugees. So you think about just the loss of the refugee resettlement program, caseworkers, staff, funding opportunities. Most of these organizations work based on grants, fewer grants, less money. It's literally decimated an entire sector of nonprofit work. It's gone. And now they're trying to slowly build it up again. But I think it's going to take some time, because how do you suddenly rehire all these folks?
Plus, even if you can't admit all the refugees that you want right now. No. The system is not built like that, right? No. So abroad, you have to have people in place who do the biometrics and who do the interviews, and that takes time to build up again. So we're not going to see the same numbers of refugees that we saw under Obama for another 2 years, right? So just a new administration doesn't mean like an increase in refugee admission this year. That's not going to happen. Yeah.
Okay, no problem. Okay. Thanks, Asma. Thanks for stopping by. Did you spell it as asthma? Oh no, Sonalini, that's like, she told me that happened to her a lot in college. I'll apologize.
Okay, it happens all the time. Spell check, it's okay.
No, it was my I'm mortified.
I'm sure it's fine.
It's like Desi crime. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, bye.
Anyway, but the point is that, Dia, to your point, I agree. I don't think they should just suddenly, it should be increased. And then you have COVID also. And let's talk about the thing. Look, I mentioned neoliberalism, colonialism, Orientalism. Let's talk about white supremacy, right? Like that refugee resettlement, there's a famous book in sociology, right? This idea of racial formation right? Omi and Wenat, that certain institutions in America are created in such a way to create certain homogenous racial institutions, to create a situation where some people are at the bottom of the top. I mentioned earlier SNAP, food stamps. That is a racial formation project because one group of people becomes very dependent on something else. The point of all of this is to say that we're not talking enough, and maybe now is a conversation, and maybe we can all collaborate on something together about looking at like the white supremacy roots of our immigration programs, on our refugee resettlement programs, not just the Christian perspective, but literally looking at race. How is the United States going to accept a large number of refugees, or even a moderate number of refugees who have been watching the events at the Capitol and just watching the, like, who is going to want to be resettled into some remote rural part of the US now knowing or thinking that you could be turned on by your neighbors because you are not helping to make America great? How is that going to be redone? And just look at Minneapolis, for example, right? So Minneapolis, that was where you had like the George Floyd murder, and you have Minnesota, which has taken in a lot of refugees over the last 40 years, first from Southeast Asia, the Somalia, other communities. But Minnesota has a huge network also of white supremacy, white nationalist groups that are kind of rising. And you can imagine that there's that tension where there's a group of people in Minnesota who want to see their state as like a paragon of virtue and inclusivity. And then there's other people looking at it as kind of like, maybe we don't need more refugees because we have enough. And then there's probably a third group saying we need more refugees to make it more diverse. And I think those elements are going to be really in conflict with each other. I'm actually worried, like what happens if they announce in the next few months that, I don't know, Minneapolis is going to receive 5,000 more Somali refugees. In the past, Minneapolis has received many Somali refugees. People probably didn't care. But what if that is now met with protest? And white men with firearms and guns, and like what happens if people, like, it sounds like civil rights era, like a group of people get off a bus and they're met with people with firearms saying, go back to Somalia, we don't want you. That could easily happen now in the US. And I don't think they're probably, so I don't know, we're in a tricky spot. I want them to restart the refugee program, but then we haven't even talked about COVID. I went an hour without talking about COVID, but like, yeah, and I'm curious, what do you guys think about this? Obviously I'm very passionate about this. The 4 students we have here, or students, but what do you guys think? What should the Biden team do? I'll start with Maria, since you're now an expert on this topic. So. I know, Sonali. I like to cold call on students, but.
Can I have time? I don't know much about US society, so.
It's okay. Okay, you don't have to answer it. It's okay. I like to call on students, but it's. Does somebody else want to chime in? Like, what should they do? Or, yeah.
Even if you had questions, I know we don't have that much more time, so.
Okay.
We have like about 20-25 minutes. I also want to leave some space if students had. I mean, it's been a really, a very broad-ranging discussion, but I think very helpful.
Okay.
So if folks had any clarifying questions or comments that they wanted to make.
Yeah. Does anybody have any questions or comments or things they would like me to explain?
One, like, I guess more like reflection. Sorry, my phone. Is just kind of like this whole like myth of like scarcity that's underlying this like ideology from Trump. But then last semester, Sonali and I were working on a modern environmental problems class where we looked at Minneapolis and how they have so little affordable housing. That's something that they're trying to create more of, but like, is this housing actually going to be accessible? And then I'm also doing a project on childhood asthma in lower investment areas and connections between housing and health So I was hoping that maybe you could talk a little bit about kind of your observations around housing. And I feel like that could be something, yeah.
Yeah. Sonali, how much time do I have?
I think we ended 3, so maybe like 20, 25 more minutes.
Okay. So
Sorry, could you repeat that?
What I said, Nelson?
Oh,
I just said we have about 20, 25 minutes. And Shyam just asked, like, he just did a time check. He just asked how much more time do we have?
okay, so I was going to say about housing. So the reason I even brought up Minneapolis a few minutes ago was because last year Trump gave a speech, I think in Minneapolis, right, where he said, he made some, or on Twitter, he may give a speech. He said something on Twitter where and I'm glad that he's been banned from Twitter, thank God for that. But like, he said something where he said that Minneapolis or Minnesota was being overrun with refugees who were like taking hospital beds and like overcrowding places, and it wasn't true, right? So Allison, I like what you brought up about scarcity, because you could argue from an economics perspective, one group in America are convinced that refugees are taking resources for other people, right? But then I'll give you an example. Someone I'm not friends with anymore on Facebook, of which I feel like I've lost many people in the last few years, but his wife posted a picture of a homeless veteran, like sleeping in a wheelchair. It was like 20 degrees outside and outside of a VA. And her caption was, "No refugees till we take care of all our veterans." Okay, but the math is flawed. The US has a huge Department of Veterans Affairs. We have the resources to take care of every veteran in the United States, right? It's a different set. I feel like we just lost someone. Oh, we lost the person who was asking the question. Oh, she's back. Okay, so I'm just saying is that, like, to say that we won't take in any more refugees because we haven't taken care of our veterans, that is such a poor understanding of how economics works. The US has the means of taking care of all of its veterans, right? We have the resources, we have the funding available, but a lot of veterans themselves don't take advantage of those resources because of their own mental health issues caused by US military involvement, right? And lack of taking care of veterans. And then the US has the means of taking care of refugees also. But when people make this argument, we shouldn't take care of refugees because we still have homeless people. Like, as we say, I speak Tamil, right? This language from India. And in Tamil, we'd say, this does not relate to that. They have no connection. And I think that's the story that needs to be told is it's not about scarcity, it's about abundance. The US has the resources to do it. It's about poor allocation, poor implementation. So we can have a robust refugee program. There is enough housing in the United States to take care of all refugee admissions and probably take care of all homeless veterans too, but we don't allocate the resources properly. That's the problem. And back to housing, and this was a big part of the Eric Tang book also about the poor housing conditions. There are, like in my experience, there are a lot of really poor housing set up for refugees across the US. So this is the sad part, right? Which is you want affordable housing, but what often happens is that refugees, their first place they live is often very poor quality, infested, very poorly insulated. So extremely hot in the summer, extremely cold in the winter, often in the poorest parts of town. But the justification is, oh, this must be better than living in a refugee camp. But what they forget is a lot of people who were displaced often are middle class or upper middle class. And they have now been, you know what I'm saying? There's this strange thing in America where we're like, well, if you come to refugee, means you came from poverty. You know, like that's, but what happens is they put people up often in very poor housing, which is why, like, I love that program that Guilford has, the e-car program of hosting refugees on campus, right? I wish that more places did something like that. But I do agree. I think that housing needs to be more consistent across the US. So it's not about an abundance of housing, it's about quality housing. And that is often neglected. Dia?
One of the things that the refugee resettlement agencies are reporting right now, Shyam, is a change in how landlords are actually asking for documentation from refugee arrivals. So the way the refugee resettlement, and forgive me if you've already mentioned this, I'm so sorry.
No.
The way the refugee resettlement program works is that refugee resettlement agencies are able to secure housing, use the stipend that the refugee arrival has to be able to pay for a deposit. They get the keys, they set it up, etc. Right now, they are so overwhelmed by how landlords are saying, no, we give you the keys when the person arrives. So it's ridiculous. I mean, it makes no sense. So someone arrives at the airport, this is their first time in the US, then you take them to sign a lease and get a key, and then what? Wait a few days before you get the furniture in there. And so it's getting worse.
Why do you think that shifted?
Because of racism. And I don't know what the shift, I think there are lots of interconnected reasons. I think it's just the lack of support under COVID-19 for folks. And we're seeing a lot of evictions. We're seeing a lot of rental arrears. And I think landlords are just responding to that, no, I mean, the refugee resettlement system is set up so that people fail, right? You come here, within 3 months, you're supposed to achieve self-sufficiency. You're supposed to take the first job that you're offered. How does that work under COVID-19? It doesn't. People aren't getting jobs, right? They're getting laid off from work. And so I think landlords are responding to the lack of financial stability with refugee tenants.
And then, of course, let's not take away from the fact that over the last 4 years, you have a president and a system that has made people hate refugees. And maybe some of these same landlords would have been more open a few years ago are now like, oh, I don't want to take a chance. So you mentioned getting the first job you take. That was a big finding I had in my dissertation, was how that affects the mental health. Like, okay, so it's one thing that, imagine if you had a master's degree and you were an accountant in your country of origin, you come to America, you have to find out that you have to pass 3 or 4 exams to become an accountant. You don't have the means to do that. Maybe you live in a state where college is expensive. Like Ohio Community College is free, okay, for everyone. I think it is now in Pennsylvania also. That's why some people want to move to those states, because free community college. But now let's say you're an accountant and you are told you got to take the first job you get. And once you get that job, suddenly you're told, oh, you're earning now. You're not going to get any more rent assistance or housing assistance. But what about if that job is extremely dangerous work? Nobody talks about that. So what happens often is that, and I wrote this in my article, is that the caseworker will tell the refugee, oh, you should take that job because it's a job. And the refugee is like, well, I need a job, I need income. But there's no discussion about whether the job actually itself could be culturally traumatizing. Case in point, 95% of Bhutanese refugees are of Nepali descent, and they are Hindu, and they are often vegetarian. So now you tell a vegetarian refugee that they have to work in a chicken processing plant. Right? And then other people are saying like, oh, you complain, when my grandparents came here from Poland, they did whatever job they could. There is so much racism in our immigration system and so much preferential treatment of European immigrants versus other countries. So what happens is that you have people taking jobs that they're not a good fit for, and the jobs, and then Dia's point, exactly, who's hiring right now? And then there's COVID. And we know there was a pork processing plant somewhere where supervisors were taking bets on how many of their workers would get COVID. And several plants have closed down because so many employees got COVID. And I mean, look, at the end of the day, we're talking about COVID now. I think the best American book ever written about labor struggles is The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. It was written in 1904 or 1905. About meat processing plants in Chicago, but it's actually the same story over and over again. Force people to work, undercut their wages, make them think that like they're earning, decrease their safety on the job, but make them so dependent on you that they know that they can't find a job somewhere else. That story never goes away. It's very sad. So, other questions people have or clarifications?
This was a topic that came up last week, and I guess I'm personally very interested in this around interracial solidarity. So you mentioned, I think in Virginia or Pennsylvania, there's a group of Asian refugees that have kind of come together and are trying to advocate for things together. I wondered if you saw other kind of coalitions or solidarity groups. Of refugees and immigrants more broadly. One of the things that came up in our discussions last week is that, there's some, we talk about racism in the white community, but, you're from India, I'm from India. There's a lot of anti-Blackness
Yeah,
in the Indian community as well, and racism and hostility towards Muslims. And so I wondered in your research whether you came across kind of these interracial solidarity actions or groups.
Sure.
In the US?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. So remember I mentioned that survey in Colorado, the RISE survey. So one of the ways that they measured integration was through a concept that is called bridging versus bonding. So bonding is when you form ties with people of your own kinship or own ethnicity. And that is a marker of integration because often refugees come to the US and it takes them some time, or immigrants broadly, to establish connections even with people from their same community. It could be religiously, ethnically, culturally, linguistically, caste-based. It could be a lot of things. So that is called bonding. So in the RISE survey, they ask questions like, have you spent time with people from your own community? Have you attended community-based events? But the other concept that's important here is called bridging. Bridging is forming inter-community connections. So bonding is intra, bridging is inter. And then that's a question they asked on the survey, which is, have you met or spent time or talked to someone from a different community? Have you spent time with someone? Have you got to know them? Have you had food? Have you had a meeting? And I think the real key to success in America for refugees is bridging, more so than bonding, right? Because when you start to bridge people together, so for example, in Clarkston, Georgia, which I've talked about before, they do a really good job on the bridging front. The Clarkston Community Center brings people together from all these different groups for them to learn from each other, realizing that the problems that this group has from Senegal is probably maybe different. Okay, so of course there's race and there's intersectionality and Black people, okay, Senegalese men are having different experiences from Senegalese women, and that is also intersect by all sorts of other things as well. But that the experiences broadly that Senegalese face in America are often the same experiences that people from Ghana might face, or people from Nigeria or Somalia or Gabon, right? That they may all face those things. So I am seeing groups in America that try to bring people together that way and place it. And it also depends. Like, so Atlanta has lots of refugees and some places have lots, but what about a place like, I don't know, Fort Hays, Kansas, okay? Like there are refugees in Kansas who probably end up there because of jobs or other things. And in those places, I think what then you have is you often have disparate groups of people forming kinship with each other because they realize that they have common issues or commonalities. So I mentioned chicken processing plants, that some of these like very, very labor intensive, but minimal qualification jobs, you often have an extremely diverse labor pool who often find kinship in labor that they otherwise may not have had before, right? And I think that's kind of powerful, that people from all these different backgrounds who may speak different languages come together because of the oppression that they are facing by these neoliberalist capitalist forces that are trying to maximize profit at the expense of their well-being. So, Dia?
Thank you. This is so exciting and so great. I'm so glad that I managed to join for a little bit. So I want to connect that to Allison's question about housing. So
Right.
One of the things that we've noticed here in Greensboro, and Allison has been around to remember, that 2 years ago, a fire happened in a housing community that killed 5 children from a DRC family. And then upon investigation, they found that this particular landlord, who's known as a ghetto or ghettoizing slumlord,
Right.
has thousands and thousands of health code violations that nobody had been addressing, right? So I just want to mention that housing is a huge issue for refugee and immigrant communities of color specifically, but it's also a huge issue for Black communities. And that one of the things that we're noticing at the CNNC is, when I sort of became a director, that one of the initiatives that the folks at the CNNC wanted to work on is bridging relationships between new Black Americans,
right,
and African American communities, because they were noticing, of course, that there's a lot of anti-African American racism among even new Black Americans, right? Because it's not just about, maybe we call it something else, not racism, but it's a sense that, African American communities have different, issues and a culture that does not necessarily align with, let's say, Black Muslim communities and so, we were trying to do this work, and then I was having conversations with people and realizing that that's the wrong way to go about this conversation. It's not how do we obviously bridge, but it's not how do we figure out how do we get along? How do we understand that our oppression is shared, right? Yes. And then organize against that oppression. Yeah. And so we're all facing housing issues. How do we come along, not to say, hey, we're both human, duh, we know that. Like that should be it, like, it's a given. How do we organize around co-resistance?
Yes, I agree.
That is the key piece, especially when it comes to housing. And I want to bring that back to the point about calling 911. I think last time we talked about institutional versus communal cultures, right? That I come from an Arab culture that does not depend on institutions, right? We depend on community. It helped me understand the difference between individualism and collectivism. It's not that Americans are individualistic, it's that American culture is institutionalized. So I depend on my kids' school so that I can do my job, right? I need to send them to school as opposed to send them to somebody in the community who can take care of them. And so I think it's trying to think about ways in which we can be anti-institutional,
right,
and focusing on collective co-resistance, to address issues like housing. Yeah.
I think the key going forward is still going to be getting people elected into office. Like getting people from refugee backgrounds or other people elected into office to then change those things. The best book that I think has ever been written on this, it came out maybe 10, 15 years ago. It's called What is the What by Dave Eggers. I'm going to put it in the chat. And it starts out, right, it's set in Clarkston, right, Georgia. And it starts out with I think a Sudanese refugee, one of the Lost Boys, getting robbed by an African-American man who says, "You're from Africa, right? You're my brother." And it illustrates that tension, right, between African-Americans and people of African descent. And you're right, I had one of my former students is of Nigerian descent, and she was explicitly told by her parents growing up, "You are not Black, you are African." Even though she perceives of herself as an African American and people phenotypically say, "Oh, she's Black," she identifies as an African immigrant or the child of African immigrants. And I've heard that from other people as well, particularly from Nigeria or Ghana, that you are African, you are not Black. And I think the long run, that creates that feeling that a lack of kinship. But again, I agree with your point. We're talking about thousands and thousands of years, right? Of or even more recently, just white supremacy and creating that racial hierarchy of who's at the top and who's at the bottom, and immigrants being told, especially Asian American immigrants, "You are so valued. You're so smarter, model minority compared to those other folks." And then that gets internalized by people, immigrants or the good immigrant, right? The model immigrant. I will say, even though, I'm grateful to be of Indian descent, it's a part of who I am. One thing that I hate, the narrative that's happening now, is that because Kamala Harris's mom, right? So this is a good way to pronounce my name, Shyam, like Shamala, right? Everyone is now able to pronounce my name because Kamala Harris's late mother's name was Shamala. So I'm Shyam. So there you go. So, but the thing is that because she was Indian, she's the good immigrant. And it kind of bothers me that people are using that narrative now, that she only made America because she's the good one. So, but I agree with you, Dia, that we need to think about, we have these common issues. How do we mobilize forward? How do we fight the common system of oppression?
And to your question to me earlier, I think that's what gives me hope. honestly, like looking at those grassroots efforts, these just sort of efforts at collective co-resistance. That's, I think, where my hope is. I agree with you about elected officials, and they're mobilizing a lot of people on the ground, and yeah.
I think flipping Georgia brought a lot of
I
people
know.
like flipping Georgia, like they say that Stacey Abrams single-handedly mobilized more Asian Americans than any person ever outside of California, right? Like getting people to believe in a common cause. So
I think this is an excellent, like, hopeful note to end on, like the power of collective organizing and mobilizing. And yeah, Shyam, this was terrific. Thank you so much for spending a good 90 minutes with us. Really, it was a really expansive and fascinating discussion. And, you know, maybe students are going to do presentations on their group projects at the end of the semester, and maybe you'd like to join us for that.
I would love that. I would love that.
But thank you so much. And if the students wouldn't mind staying back for just a minute at the end, I just want to make one final announcement. But Shyam, thank you. Please join me all in thanking Shyam for his excellent talk.
Thank you. Appreciate it. I'll talk to you guys later. Dia, nice to meet you, and I'll see you soon.
Yeah, it's on my calendar. I don't know what, I live one day at a time. And so that morning I will be there.
Okay, sounds good. Okay. See you guys later. Bye.
Bye.
And I'll send you the recording.
Great.